Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session. I have the privilege of introducing our afternoon speaker. Before that, I think we're officially at the halfway mark of the conference, so hopefully it's been good and you're enjoying yourselves and things have been good. I feel like I'm a little fearful that the kitchen worries are going to run out of refrigerator space because I think our places have been set up as backup. It's like 30, it's been freezing in some of these rooms. So if that's the case, let us know so we can let engineering know. I went up to the lunch place and I was like, oh my goodness. Hopefully, like I said, hopefully you're having, learning a lot, connecting up with others. Hopefully you're having a little bit of fun. Last night was fun. So for those of you that stayed late enough, you got to see me dance a little bit. Yeah, it's always that group that goes up there that dances no matter what, and they're having a great time and all that. And then they think it's fun to want to pull those of us that don't want to be up there and can't dance. You know what would make it more fun is if you didn't bring the 3 people with cameras and videos and all that stuff to sit back in the office, right? It'd be even more fun if I could just stay in my chair. Barry Sackin this afternoon, he brings a very unique perspective, unique amount of experience to visiting with us. He was an operator earlier in his career at Anaheim Union. He was staff vice president of public policy at the School Nutrition Association in Alexandria, Virginia. And he also had some time in industry. He was part of a group that was a founding incubator of SchoolLink Technologies, which was one of the companies that Heartland acquired in 2011. In addition to that, then as he's gone on and done consulting, he's also served on the ACTA board, the American Commodities Distribution Association board, and has been a stint on the PPL committee for several years, and keeps us very much up to speed on all things policy and things that affect child nutrition regulations. So this afternoon, in addition to public policy, and I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here, the right to petition Congress and some of the things with that, Barry also has extensive knowledge in procurement and is also really dialed in on the participation numbers and the unfortunate somewhat decrease that we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years. So while we're going to talk about this, I'm assuming some of those things might be fair game in the Q&A, possibly, as we get to that. On a personal note, Barry's been very instrumental in my career. When I got started 11 years ago, he's worked with us since then to help me kind of learn more, or learn a lot more about this industry. And certainly you all have taught me quite a bit. Sometimes I feel like I need to have somebody else I can ask, so I'm not taking your time. Barry was that person and has grown from colleague to friend. So with that, I'd like to introduce Barry Sackin, the right to petition Congress.
Good afternoon. If it's cold in here now, I promise to fill it with hot air. When people ask me how much time I need, I said, give me whatever you have, like hot air, I'll fill whatever space you have. We're going to talk about the right to petition Congress. As Jeremy said, in 1997, I was on the board of the School Nutrition Association, and the person who was the manager of government affairs left to go to California. Her husband got transferred, and I called the director and I said, I have some thoughts about what you could do with the department now that you have this vacancy. And she said, well, I actually see you doing it, which came out of left field. I had no knowledge. I was a history major in college, but how's that apply? And I've been doing advocacy things as a school director for a number of years. We'll talk about one of those experiences in a minute. And I said, well, sure, the time was right. My kids were getting out of high school and moving on with their lives. And so I came back and ended up doing reasonably well at it. It was an interesting experience. I got a question. How many people, by a show of hands, are under 39 years of age? I started in school food service before you were born. I started in San Diego City schools almost exactly 39 years ago. Thought it was going to be a short-term thing while I worked on a master's degree, and then fell in love with the industry. It's such a phenomenal place to be with incredible people committed to doing wonderful things. So I'm happy to be here and to share some of my experience. Now, This is not going to be about me, although I'm going to be talking about my experiences. I've been very blessed in my life to have had the opportunity to do some things and meet some people and influence policy in ways that a lot of people just don't get a chance to do. Some of which you may be happy with things that I've done, some of which you may not be so happy with things that I've done. And we're going to talk about my experiences advocating lobbying for child nutrition programs. This is the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting, down to petition the right of the government for redress of grievances, which is a constitutionally guaranteed right for you as citizens to lobby your members of Congress and the Senate, to lobby your representatives. Constitutionally guaranteed that you can do that. Lobby is not a four-letter word, as you're going to see in just a minute, but here's a definition from the dictionary on what a lobbyist is. Some people, when I did research on this, it started in Parliament in England, but the local legend is that President Grant loved to smoke cigars, and he'd walk across the street from the White House to the Willard Hotel. They had a cigar bar there, and he wanted to smoke his cigars. And so lobbyists knew that that's where they could find him, so they would gather in the lobby and pester him about things that they wanted him to do as president. Why do we need lobbyists? I updated this. You can't see the data too clearly, but this is about 10 years worth of data that you can get on how many bills get introduced in Congress. 14,000 bills in a two-session Congress, and Congress runs in two-year cycles. 14,000 bills, of which maybe 300 become law. Now, some of those other bills get folded in, so like child nutrition reauthorization, which we may or may not have sometime in the near future. There may be 10, 15, 20 bills on child nutrition that will be introduced in Congress that will all get folded into a larger bill for child nutrition reauthorization. So some of those bills actually do become law, but not standalone, not on their own. But when you think about 14,000 bills and 535 members of the House and Senate, what are the chances that they know the details, the depth of information to be able to make policy, to write laws about all of those things? They can't, and their staff can't. The average age of the House staffer is about 23. You were feeding them just a couple of years ago. The average age of a Senate staffer is about 27. So not too much further. Some stay a very long time. Some of my closest contacts on the Hill have been there for 25, 30 years. Some of them, when their member retires, they run and take over that seat, which is interesting. But they cannot possibly know as much as you know about child nutrition programs. They can't. And it's not an area that's one of the big ticket items. The ag committees tend to be not favored committees for members of Congress as they apply to be on committees. Education and labor don't have, it's not a big major, it's not appropriations or defense or any of the other big ticket committees. So Congress relies on people like you, like me, who know the details of our programs and can explain and help guide them in policy. Now, they're going to have their large philosophical view of government that will guide what side they fall out on an issue. But as we'll talk a little bit later, the 2005 reauthorization, which was one of my more impactful bills, we had 23 provisions in there that were small details, operational details, that made a big difference for you as operators, but nobody would have thought of had not people who actually run programs come in and talk to them. It's not the kind of things that they would have paid attention to. This is what legislation looks like. This is Section 101 of the last reauthorization, and as you can see, in subparagraph B, by striking beginning on and all that after, when I look at a bill that's been introduced, or look at a law, laws tend to, particularly in our world, amend existing statutes. And so I will read it with 3 screens open so that I can look at what they're referring to, look at the bill that's been introduced, and try and figure out exactly what they're doing where, and then interpret the language. It's a very arcane and esoteric field of study to be able to read legislation. We're going to start with something that's current, and it's current, but it's very old. In 1992, I was director of food service for the schools in Anaheim. There was an article in the Orange County Register that said that the cost of renting an apartment in Anaheim was the highest in the nation. And I was looking at my kids who struggled. I was looking at my reduced price participation, which is where we see it a lot. And kids couldn't afford to come in and buy lunch. Couldn't afford 40 cents. They couldn't, if they were above that, they couldn't afford my 80-cent meal price at the time. And so I went and called on my local congressman. As a citizen, as a food service director, I went and called on Bill Dannemeyer, and I went in and I said, Mr. Dannemeyer, we have a problem, and I explained the problem to him, and he looked at me and said, so you think my kids should get something that my colleague in Mississippi doesn't get? And I said, no, I think the kids here deserve the same thing as the kids who live in Mississippi, because on the income that qualifies for reduced price in Mississippi, they're not uncomfortable, they're living okay. But here in California, they can't. It's just too expensive. And as you know, and if you've been reading the papers, this problem has gotten a lot worse in the 27 years since I first started advocating for it. And so I've worked on this issue for 27 years. We are making progress. I'm very, very excited to say that Congressman Mike Levin, new member of Congress from just around the corner from me, we met during LAC, some of our directors from California met with him, expressed this was a California issue, talked about it, he got interested. I've drafted a 5-state pilot because the question, nobody disagrees with it conceptually, well, how much does it cost? Which is the first thing Congress always asks. Well, I don't know. We got the Government Accountability Office to do a study a few years ago, but they stopped short of answering that question. So I wrote a pilot so we can find out how many kids would benefit, what it would cost. Last Friday, I got a copy of the legislation. I sent a draft. The Legislative Council has now rewritten it, left out some important things. Congressman Levin's staff sent me their draft, said, what do you think? And I wrote 2 pages explaining what they had missed. That's what lobbyists do. Nobody in Congress would have figured this out. Nobody in Congress would have thought about, they might have been aware of the issue, but not how it affects you and your kids. And what we're looking at is indexing eligibility based on the cost of living county by county around the country, 3,300 counties in the country. I bring it up because if this is something that's going to affect your kids, I'm more than happy to keep you in the loop. I'll give you my email address when we're done. And you, as a citizen lobbyist, can start talking to your member of Congress that you have a constitutionally guaranteed right to do, to say, Congressman Levin is introducing this bill, I want you to get on board with this bill. Okay. The dark side of lobbying, why people give it a bad name, and well-deserved in many, many cases. I mean, when we take a look at drug prices today, Big Pharma and the way that they go about their lobbying certainly impacts us every day in what we pay for prescriptions. But you have to understand that every member of Congress, their first job, every elected official, your school board members, every elected official, their first job is their next election. And it costs a lot. You've seen the numbers up there. How much does it cost? Members of Congress, they call it dialing for dollars. If you go over to the Democratic National Office, Democratic Party's national office, they've got these little cubicles with telephones and lists. And every day, every member of Congress is required to spend a certain amount of time dialing for dollars. When I first started getting those calls when I was in Washington, I was, wow, Congresswoman Woolsey just called me, ain't that cool? Until I realized I was one of 100 calls she made in that 2-hour window asking for money. And that's what they have to do. They have to raise a lot of money every day. We need to, personal opinion, and I'm going to try and stay away from politics on all this stuff as best I can. Jeremy will laugh at that. Every day they have to raise a certain amount of money. We need to fix the campaign finance law, which has gone even more topsy-turvy in the last 15 years. if we're going to get away from this and have them actually focus on what's important, which is writing laws that help us. So what does that money buy? This $1,000 a plate is an old price. It goes back to 2003. I was in Washington, and John Boehner was the chairman. Now, John Boehner went on to become Speaker of the House. But Mr. Boehner was chairman of what was then the Education and Workforce Committee. Some of what I'm going to talk about is how government and how legislation really works. Mr. Boehner was chairman of Education and the Workforce Committee because the Republicans controlled Congress. When the Democrats took back the House, just happened a few months ago, they changed it back to education and labor. Republicans don't like the idea of labor, they like the idea of workforce. So and it costs a lot of money. They keep the signs now, but when you go to Congress, you'll see these brass plaques, Committee on Education and the Workforce, or Committee on Education and Labor. It costs money to make those plaques that they have. When the Republicans are in control, they put up the education and workforce blocks, and when the Democrats are in control, it's education and labor. That's how things go. But Mr. Boehner was chairman of Education and the Workforce at the time, which is the committee that has jurisdiction for our programs. He was more interested in education. Nutrition, which is part of that, was sort of a low priority. He had a staffer who had been advocate for what was then the American Dietetics Association. It was his staffer at that point. And so he had a dinner at a very posh steakhouse. Mr. Boehner, there is a federal law, there has been for about 30 years, that you cannot smoke in public buildings, in government buildings. That didn't apply to Chairman Boehner. If you walked into his office, it reeked of cigarettes. He would smoke one from the other. So we're in a restaurant, a public building, which had a no smoking sign out front as he lit one cigarette from the next. He was chairman of the committee. He was a very important person. So we sat down at dinner. There were about 35 or 40 people. And the way these things work is you go in, you paid your $1,000 to be in the room. And normally when you go to a reception or a dinner, you get your 1 minute of FaceTime with the member. So we're sitting there, and he did his introductory statement before the salad. And he said, anybody have any questions? And nobody raised their hand. And being the shy, shrinking violet that I am, I said, well, Mr. Chairman. And I raised some issues that we were dealing with. We were in the middle of a reauthorization cycle, and I asked a question, and we had a dialogue. And the salads were served, and we ate our salads, and we got to the break between the next course, and the other questions. And nobody raised their hand. For an hour, Mr. Boehner and I had a two-way conversation about child nutrition reauthorization and about child nutrition issues. And his staffers credits that dinner with the fact that he recognized that he had responsibility for this area and took an interest in it. And as I said, the 2004 reauthorization, 2003, 2004, 2005, it floats, that reauthorization was one of the broadest bills that we've had in a very long time on child nutrition reauthorization, because he took an interest in it, and I was able to dialogue with him, which opened the door for me to meet with his staff on a regular basis, and was fairly successful. Statutes authorize, regulations implement. So what we saw in 2010 with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was a direction from Congress to USDA to look at and make meals conform to the current edition of the dietary guidelines. Big, broad policy. Meals must do this. What happened after that, and what, depending on your perspective, created headaches for all of us, was that the Department of Agriculture, one of the cabinet departments, was then given the responsibility for writing regulations to implement what Congress authorized. And hence we ended up with the new menu planning regulations and a bunch of other stuff. We ended up with professional standards and just a lot of things that came out of the statute authorization to the administration. What happened in this case is that the normal process for regulations is that excuse me, Congress, the administration, in this case Department of Agriculture, will put out a proposed regulation. They'll ask for comments. We all get a chance to comment on it. and then they turn around and they are required to respond to everyone they got, but not individually. They aggregate them into, on this particular area, we received 350 comments that supported doing this and 250 that did not support it, and they have to respond to it. And normally what would happen then, depending on the rule, is that it'll come out as either an interim or final regulation. Interim regulations are regulations that go into effect but can be changed easily because, well, we don't really know what the impact is going to be, so we're going to do this, we're going to implement it, and then we're going to get more information and we can change it. A final rule is just that, final. It takes to me an entirely new regulatory process if you want to change a final rule. In the case of child nutrition menu planning requirements, normally this is done by career staff. But without going into, I can go into detail if you want, but unfortunately the staff that got appointed to USDA, the political appointees, came in with a very aggressive agenda that was driven by a couple of segments of the nutrition community, and they took over writing that rule. It did not come out of our friends at Food and Nutrition Service, it came out of the Secretary's office, and came out 11 months after the proposed rule was published. A final rule was published, which meant that, and their reasoning, and they were very public about it, is we don't want somebody who comes after us to be able to change this. Even though we knew that there were problems in what they were proposing, some of which they have rolled back, is the term that's being used, that they have adjusted to make it more realistic for you. So Congress authorizes, regulations implement. And lobbying does extend to regulations. As I said, proposed rule comes out, you get to comment on it, and they are supposed to respond to your comments. Frequently they will say, well, we heard this and we learned something and we're going to change it. Sometimes they'll say, as they did in 1995, the last time menu planning rules were changed, they said, well, we got all of these people who said this won't work, nevertheless we're going to do it anyway. And they did. And it's also interesting, I take a little bit of, I guess I'll call it pride in the fact that a bunch of us wrote very lengthy comments on the 1995 rule about why nutrient standard menu planning was a bad idea. And when they came out with the current version of menu planning and did away with nutrient standard menu planning rules, the reasons they gave were the same ones we had told them in 1995, and how much time and energy and money and aggravation would we have saved if they'd listened to us in the first place. Regulatory process, statutory, internal and external. The statutory one is something where the law written by Congress says this is what you're going to do, and they just write a rule to do it. No questions, that's what Congress wants. Internally generated rules are ones that they see they have a problem and they want to address it and they write a rule. And then some come from us, where we say, here's something that we need to have addressed. With working with ACTA, with the American Combined Distribution Association, there are a number of things that ACTA has advocated for and brought to USDA that USDA said, oh, yes, we'll write rules about that. Discretionary and non-discretionary rules, when Congress says, this is what we want you to do, and you do it. And there's no black, it's all a black and white question in the statute. Non-discretionary or discretionary rules are ones where they can do it or not. They can do it however they want. Non-discretionary rules usually end up in an interim regulation so that they have a chance to actually test them out. The appropriations process is an interesting one and affects us quite directly. Now, school meals, school lunch, school breakfast, most of the other programs are permanently authorized mandatory spending, which means that even during that government shutdown back in the late fall, your funding was secure. You were going to get it. There have been times when that's happened where you got your money late, but it's performance-based. The government makes a compact with you that we're going to give you this much money for every free lunch, every reduced lunch, and every paid lunch that you serve. That doesn't go away unless Congress changes it. But other things require an appropriation every year. It's very interesting that the government shutdown and all of that is over the non-mandatory discretionary spending, which is only about 15% of the federal budget, is discretionary, but it's what we get tied up in knots about every year as they go through. Appropriations, and the interesting thing about appropriations, the rules, congressional rules say you cannot legislate with appropriations, which means you can't change the law, you just fund or not fund. The funding or not funding, and it's the argument, regardless of the position you take on it, on the president's wall, is that Congress specifically said we are not going to appropriate money for the wall. And the reason why a significant number of Republicans in Congress, enough for the House and the Senate to vote on a resolution against diverting money to build the wall, their reason, the Republican reason primarily, is that's not the president's prerogative. The Constitution says that the control of funds rests with Congress. And so by doing what he did, Mr. Trump contravenes the Constitution, and that's where the fight is going to be. And as this progresses, which it will, and eventually make its way through the courts, we guess, they're going to be talking about whether the president has the authority to do this or not. But it also means, and that's a perfectly good example, he did it through executive order, perfectly good example of using the purse to direct legislation. So, a couple of years ago, as we were working on flexibility in school meals, and S&A was absolutely wonderful and successful on this, we went to the Appropriations Committee, and the Appropriations Committee wrote into the annual appropriations bill, no money may be spent for enforcing the rules on proteins and the rules on milk and the other issues that we've brought to them that required flexibility. So they controlled, even though you can't legislate, they were able to control legislation by controlling whether there was money to do it or not. It's a heavy-handed approach, but it happens more frequently than we would like, that the way Congress controls what the administration does is by giving them money or not giving them money. So, some stories from the trenches. Any questions on this sort of larger picture of how it all works? Some stories from the trenches. 1995 Personal Responsibilities Act. You may remember that Newt Gingrich masterminded the 1994 election with what he called the Contract with America. It included a set of principles and required every Republican candidate to sign on to his contract, that they had to run on the contract. And number one was what they called personal responsibility. It was the first bill introduced in Congress. So I said there are 14,000 bills introduced. H.R. 1 was the first bill introduced, and one of the things that it did was propose to block grant school meals. Now, Newt Gingrich, all politics is local. That's why your role as a citizen lobbyist and being actively involved in the process is so important. In 1992, Mr. Gingrich was being challenged by a Democratic opponent who actually ran a cookie company. Go figure. And Mr. Gingrich was running, and Congress, the way they give themselves raises is through the Post Office Appropriations Bill. The Postal Appropriations Bill, don't ask why, it's just historically and traditionally how it's done. And they had given themselves a raise. And normally when that happens, there's funny ways that occurs. But they didn't want, at that point in time, we were in the middle of yet another financial downturn, and they didn't want to have to stand up and defend giving themselves raises when so many Americans were not getting raises and were financially suffering. And so they made a pact, the Democrats and the Republicans made a pact, that anybody who ran and raised the fact that a sitting member of Congress had voted in favor of a raise for Congress would not get funds from the national committees. And this fool from Georgia who, the cookie man, said, Mr. Gingrich voted in favor of a raise for Congress. And the Democrats didn't fund it. And very narrowly, Newt Gingrich won that election. Had he not won that election, he would not have become the leader of the party in the House, the head of the caucus. He would not have been in a position to have his contract with America, and we would not have dealt with the Gingrich Revolution in 1995. So that those few votes, because of this pact made by the two parties, affected things. So he came out with the contract, and one of the things in there, as I said, was block granting school meals. And we can talk about what block granting is and it's reared its ugly head again in the last couple of years. But citizen lobbyists, you guys, along with several million of our friends who are not school food service, went to Congress, and you may remember the hue and cry about how Congress was going to take food off the plates of children in schools. The Republicans, several years later when I was working on the Hill, and the Republicans remembered that and thought we had lied through our teeth to make that happen. But we did what James Carville, the pundit and Democratic operative from Louisiana, said: we school lunched Congress. And that meant that through the efforts of the school lunch community, all of you folks, those of you who were around then, that we were able to shine a light on just how mean-spirited the contract with America was, and it lost and began eroding a lot of the agenda that Mr. Gingrich ran on, and then he got his Republican colleagues to run on. And they called it school lunching of Congress. As I said, in 1998, when we were working on the next reauthorization, the senior staffer on the Republican side, we got into a very heated discussion in his office one afternoon as he talked about how we had lied and maligned the Republicans. That's not what they intended to do at all. But that resulted from a concerted effort by citizen lobbyists, just like you and me, doing our job to talk about things that Congress might not quite be aware of. And the tradition of school lunch, they picked the wrong fight, because the tradition of school lunch in this country, particularly in the Southeast, is incredibly strong. And it's part of the social fabric of the community. So they picked a silly fight. You know, Georgia has phenomenal school food service programs, and the people in Georgia were not happy that Mr. Gingrich was going after their school lunch. 98 reauthorization. We had a congresswoman from California who had been a WIC mom in her early life, who wanted universal school breakfast. She called it Meals for Achievement, and that was not going to fly. And so we came up with doing a pilot, much as I'm talking about our regional eligibility indexing, to do a pilot for it. And everybody said, okay, and Bill Goodling was the chairman of education and the workforce at the time. He'd been in Congress for 25 years. He'd been a good friend of ours, except he kept moving further to the right as the conservative presence in Congress got stronger. And if he wanted to maintain his rank, his seniority, his ability to be a chairman, he had to fall in line with what the speaker was telling him. And the big debate came over whether, as we talked earlier about the appropriations process, whether it was going to be funded by mandatory funds, which meant that we'll just take $20 million from the money that's going to school meals, that's guaranteed, and we'll put it to this, or discretionary, that you have to go to the appropriations committee and have them fund it for you. And Mr. Goodling, in line with what his speaker told him, wanted it to be discretionary funding. So we're strategizing, how do we make this happen? How do we get, now, when, by law, the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, and then they have to get together in what's called a conference and iron out the differences in the bill, because by law, the same bill has to come from the House and the Senate to go to the President to be signed. There was a situation about 10, 12 years ago where they had a couple of technical spelling or punctuation differences between the two bills that the President signed. They actually had to repass the bill after they cleaned up these little discrepancies, which is kind of interesting. But we're saying, okay, how do we get the conference, because they appointed a conference, to agree to mandatory spending? Normally conferences are resolved by staff. They either meet or they have back and forth phone calls, and the staff, who knows what their bosses want, figure it all out, and then they go to the members of Congress and say, this is what we've settled on. The members say, yeah, that sounds okay to us, and then they vote on it. It passes, or doesn't pass, but it usually passes when they get to that point. In this case, the only sticking point was mandatory versus discretionary funding. And they actually had a conference committee. Conference committee is when the appointees from the majority and minority in the House and the majority and minority in the Senate, literally the members of Congress sit down in a room. In this case, it was a conference room in the basement of the Capitol. They're open. We were able to sit in there, and we're trying to figure out what to do. So the night before, Marshall Matz, who was my lobbying partner, SNA's legislative counsel, was meeting with Ed Barron, who was Pat Leahy's staff on the Senate committee. They had a long relationship. Ed was a really good guy, and they're sitting around late in the evening trying to figure out what to do. And I don't know which one of, I wasn't there, I don't know which one of them came up and said, well, you know, Bill Goodling's retiring this year. And he's done so much for 25 years. Let's name the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Bill after him. And we'll butter him up at the conference tomorrow morning. And he'll feel really good about that, and he'll give us the mandatory spending. Great idea. So we all go into the room, the members of Congress, the senators and congressmen come in, and they sit around, and the Senate chaired the meeting. House usually wins in these debates, but so we're sitting around, and they get started, and Marshall walks up to Ed and whispers in his ear and says, oh yeah, and Ed leans over and whispers in Senator Leahy's ear, and Senator Leahy raises his hand, Mr. Chairman, I guess Bill Goodling was chairing at the time, said, Mr. Chairman, I have a point to make before we go any further. Yes, Senator Leahy. We would like to respect and reflect on the contributions you've made to child nutrition in your 25 years in Congress, and name this the William F. Goodling Child Nutrition and Reauthorization Act. And Mr. Goodling, oh thanks, shucks, that's so nice, that's really nice, and you're not getting your mandatory money anyway. He said, well, it gets worse. It gets worse. So he says, but you go ahead, you go to the Appropriations Committee, and you get the money, and I will not stand in your way. You know, I'm okay with it if you can get them to do it. And the next day, he wrote a letter to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee saying, over my dead body, you give him the money. Which really, pardon my language, but it's accurate, pissed off the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. If you didn't want us to fund this, why the heck did you pass it? Now the ball's in our court, and we're going to be the ones who look bad. It took 2 years. We eventually got the $20 million for funding the pilot on Meals for Achievement. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, we weren't able to demonstrate that universal breakfast achieved what we thought and hoped that it would achieve. That's how legislation gets done. And that's not an unusual circumstance of how you lobby, how you navigate the legislative process. Then we get to 2010, the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. Nutrition standards, as I mentioned before, they did away with nutrient standard menu planning, just as we told them, and for the very reasons we told them 10 years earlier. A lot of this came out of it being Michelle Obama's issue. Mrs. Melania Trump, it's be your best, or be best is her theme. I have an idea where Mrs. Obama got the idea childhood obesity was an issue that she as First Lady would be comfortable with. I mean, we all saw her garden and we saw all the wonderful things that she did. And in all honesty, only once did I ever hear her say something that I felt was inappropriate or rude about our programs. And she was tired that day. But for the most part, she was really good. But what, as we were getting ready for the current administration, and I was telling my friends, I'm more concerned, and I would not say it today, but I'm more concerned about who they appoint to the administrative positions, who the secretaries and undersecretaries and other political appointees are, than I am who's going to be president, because they can do more good or damage than the president. I don't know that I could say that safely today, but at the time, so the people that got appointed to the secretary's office, the deputy secretary, the senior advisors in the secretary's office, were driven by a coalition of, I call them the Whole Foods moms. The ones who don't understand why not everybody shops in the Whole Foods, because there ain't no Whole Foods in the barrio, lady. We ain't got that there. But those were the people who were driving the agenda, and aggressively so. It did not come out of the Food and Nutrition Service. And they went through the rulemaking, and they came out. I had the good fortune and honor of being one of the external reviewers of the Institute of Medicine report on school meals. And when you read the report, it says, this is not a policy recommendation. This is, you asked us to say nutritionally, what should school meals look like? That's what we're telling you. But there are problems with this. The kids may not accept it. It's going to be expensive. We don't think this is necessarily good policy, but that's not the question you asked us. You asked us to come up with a meal pattern that meets the dietary guidelines, regardless of your feeling about the dietary guidelines. And that's the power of political appointees. Brings us to today, by the way. We do not have an Undersecretary for Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services more than 2 years into this administration. And what I heard most recently is that it's unlikely that we will for the rest of this term, at least, maybe going forward. We can sort of posit why that's the case, but we don't have senior political appointees in our department. Fortunately, we have incredibly competent and qualified and supportive people in career positions, but they're limited in what they can do. They don't have the authority to make big steps forward. And we've been fortunate in Congress that we've had some friends who understood our concerns and have, through the legislative and appropriations process, given us some flexibility. I had the opportunity to create something called the Coalition on Sustainable School Meal Programs. In all honesty, the funding for doing this came from industry, but 2/3 of the people in the coalition were school food service directors. And we were successful because those of you who were around and involved in menu planning knew that you had caps on grains and breads, you had caps on protein, and which made absolutely no sense and complicated your jobs enormously, and were totally unnecessary and redundant to other parts of the menu planning rule. And I had the opportunity to testify before Congress to explain that, and as I said, we were fortunate enough to be successful in getting some of the more egregious problems resolved. Potatoes, limit on white potatoes. White potatoes are an interesting subject, and I'm not going to argue nutrition with you, but they're a great source of potassium. And when you look at sodium and potassium, the evidence is fairly strong that insufficient potassium is a greater health risk than too much sodium. But they go after sodium, they don't go after. If they started mandating a banana on lunch 3 times a week, I'd be a little more comfortable with the position they take on sodium. But we were able to have a press conference with Susan Collins from Maine testifying or speaking to the press about when Maine's got a lot of potatoes, about why potatoes are not an evil food. How they're prepared does make a difference and all that, and I'm not going to argue nutrition with you. But so we were, as lobbyists, and I was not working for the association anymore at that point. I was a citizen, and I was lobbying Congress about a specific thing that they would not normally know or think about. Brings us to 2015 child nutrition reauthorization, which you may understand and know already, never happened. House and the Senate both got bills out of committee. The Senate came close to getting it on the floor of the Senate, but as the staffer said, there was a phone call, there must have been 100 of us on the phone, and he said, this bill is a delicate balance, and anything that you don't like and we change is going to cause a problem over here that because of how we balance this whole thing, and so we know that nobody's going to like this whole bill. Hopefully nobody's going to hate parts of it badly enough to undermine it. They never got it to the floor. They couldn't get enough votes. But in the House, the chairman of the House Education and the Workforce Committee was a woman named Virginia Fox from North Carolina. And in her draft of the bill, she was going back to block granting school meals. Block grants mean that schools get a fixed amount of money. Actually, it's going to be a pilot for 3 states. Get a fixed amount of money based on how much they got the previous year, not adjusted for participation or enrollment growth, not adjusted for cost of living. We're going to take how much you got, and for the next 3 years, you're going to get that amount of money still, which violates the compact we have that you get money for every meal you serve. So if you hit March or April and you ran out of funds, you're SOL. there's no more money for you. This is all we're giving you. And it's called a capped entitlement. There's a variety of ways of talking about it. And during the hearing in the House committee, Representative Crotham from Wisconsin said, I don't know why we're messing around with pilot. Let's just block grant the damn program. And out of 33 people in the room, they got 8 people who voted in favor of his amendment to block grant the whole program. One of those was the chairwoman of the committee, which scared the heck out of me. So I was very happy that we didn't get a reauthorization. She is not chairperson anymore. She's still on the committee. But Congressman Scott, who is the chairman now, has no interest in block granting. The Senate, Republicans and Democrats had no interest. What was the source of that coming up? The Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative lobbying bloc, they like block grants. Now what's interesting, as I've researched this over the years, the guy who was responsible for introducing the concept of block grants during the Reagan administration had an op-ed piece in the New York Times about 4 years ago saying, worst policy proposal I ever made, block grants don't work. They're bad policy, they are ineffective, and they do a lot of damage. This is the guy who created the concept of block grants, who said, don't do it. But the Heritage Foundation likes block grants, mostly because it's a good way to cut funding for people who don't have as much of a say, who are not wealthy, the kids, many of the kids that we serve. They were able to get to Congress and get them to include this pilot, figuring that that's the camel's nose under the tent, that once they did the pilot, they would then be able to move to block granting our programs down the road. It failed, thank goodness. Will it come back? At some point, maybe. When you take a look, I mean, there's 100 new members of Congress this year. There's not a lot of institutional history. Very few people there remember the fights of 1994 and 95. So they don't remember how they got school lunched and the public outcry from citizen lobbyists. They don't have that history to draw on. So could they do it again? Yes. Do we have to stay vigilant? Yes. Do we have to, as citizen lobbyists, make sure that our members of Congress understand, because you are the expert in child nutrition, that when you tell them this is a bad idea and why, that they listen to you? So we can't ignore this. For right now, I think we're okay, but who knows? It's your right and your responsibility. You are the experts in child nutrition. Go back to the start of my comments and how many bills they have to address and the variety of things that they have to deal with. They do not have your expertise in school nutrition programs. There's no way they could. You know, every once in a while you run into a member of Congress whose mother was a lunch lady. And you know, they're very proud of that, but they don't know how the program operates. This regional indexing bill that Mr. Levin is going to introduce, I talked to his staff extensively, had no idea of how school meals work, didn't understand eligibility and application and approval for school meals, and had to be explained from the very base, from the bottom line of how this works. Somebody had to explain it to them. That's your job. That's your job to be the expert. One of the favorite calls I ever got when I was Vice President of Public Policy for SMA was a woman from Alabama whose congressman's office had called because a bill was coming up and wanted to know what her opinion of it was because they didn't understand it and wanted to know what it meant. She wasn't too sure. She called me for an explanation and a discussion of where SNA was on the bill. The fact that that member of Congress staff called a food service director for the food service director to explain says that she was a successful citizen lobbyist. That's your responsibility. How do you do it? The case that I just gave is a great example. You build relationships. It's not, how many of you have gone to LAC in DC? Yeah, have you been back? Besides the letter that you wrote, have you tried to visit in his office? Have you, all of those things, it's a relationship. It's not a one-time deal. It's not go to Washington and make your call with the SNA issue paper or whatever you go in with. It's being the person that they turn to when they have a question about our programs. And there are people like me who are available to help you when you get specific questions. One of the things that we always tell the California delegation is, saying I don't know is an acceptable answer, I will get back to you, and then you do get back to them. And you ask somebody who can help you understand it. And there are people, SNA's staff is phenomenal for that. There are people who can help you with those things. But you have to have the relationship first. You should stay focused. When I would call on Congress, whether it was as a lobbyist for the association or when I do my lobbying as a citizen before and after my stint with the association, the only thing I ever talked about was child nutrition. I have opinions about a lot of things. I care about a lot of things. I actually have some knowledge about a lot of things. But when I go in, that's the only thing I talk about. So Ron Packard was the representative from northern San Diego County, southern Orange County, and his district abutted where I live. And I don't even remember what the issue was, but I needed to go in and see him. And it's always good to have a constituent, somebody who actually votes for him in those meetings. So I went to my friend Howard Sackin, who's the director in Carlsbad, and I said, Howard, we're going to have an appointment with Congressman Packard, and I want you to go with me. And Howard was an interesting character, curly Afro-style hair, wearing a lavender shirt with a thin purple tie and no jacket, hippie-ish looking. And I was wearing my suit. And we go in to call on Packard, and if anything, share my personal side, I am further to the left than most people. We went in, and Packard looks at me, and he looks at Howard, and he looks at me, and he says, we'll set this guy straight, won't we? Because all that Packard knew was what he knew about me and child nutrition. He didn't know the rest of my views. I stayed focused on the things that I wanted him to know, that I was going to be his expert on child nutrition, and the other issues, even though I disagreed with him on 90% of his views, we never talked about. So stay focused on what you do and what you know. Keep it local. As I said early, every member of Congress, their first job is getting elected, and in spite of money coming from all over the country to different races, the people in the district are the ones that vote. So industry folks, your responsibility as employers, as money generators in their district matter. You have a critical role to play in that discussion. Those of you who are in districts that can mobilize your parents to write letters or go visit a member of Congress, keep it local. They are dependent on you for all the money they may bring in from another state. Those people in the other state don't have a vote in that election. Keep it local. Now it's your turn. I've shared, I've got lots more stories. I think I don't do presentations, just tell stories. I can tell you lots more stories, but what questions do you have about this or what's going on currently in legislation and policy? Anything at all. We've got about 10 minutes or so.